Do you remember this? Let me see if you remember this. Given the fact that former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright recently died, on 60 Minutes on May 12th, 1996, Leslie Stahl was interviewing Madeleine Albright. And she posed a question to the then Secretary of State. Leslie Stahl said, quote, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?" Albright: "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." Do you remember that? That absolutely, I mean, that was a real mind fuck for me. Now, we were not actively engaged in a shooting war. We had just imposed so many harsh sanctions on Iraq that people were dying. They were starving to death. Now, the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who said that, her calmly asserting that U.S. policy objectives were worth the sacrifice of 500,000 Arab children. That has been quoted many times in the Arabic press. And it's also been cited in this country in the form of alternative commentary on what happened here September 11th, 2001, the attacks on this country. But I'm quoting from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting from their website. Back in the day, they said a Dow Jones search of mainstream news sources since September 11th turns up only one reference to what Madeleine Albright said, and that was an op-ed in the Orange County, California Register newspaper on September 16th, 2001. Now, the omission from corporate media, mainstream press in this country, the omission of any reference to what Madeleine Albright said is striking when you consider the major role that the Iraq sanctions played in the ideology of, America's archenemy, Osama bin Laden. Well, I bring this up for a number of reasons. First of all, I spent part of the weekend reading a piece at Counterpunch. Are you familiar with Counterpunch? Boy, you should be. You want some leftist points of view? I mean, really progressive left, really democratic socialists like Howard Zinn, like Noam Chomsky. Then go to Counterpunch. The editor there is Jeffrey St. Clair. The managing editor is Joshua Frank. And I don't know if Alexander Coburn founded Counterpunch, but he was their editorial writer and chief writer for years until he died. He died in, about 10 years ago. Alexander Coburn. I know a lot of people remember him and his writings. But one of the people who works at or writes for Counterpunch and other publications is a man named Paul Street. And he has a piece up at Counterpunch right now that should be required reading. He talks about us Americans. Okay, we Americans. Being products of television and Hollywood, as we are. We want very clearly delineated good guys and bad guys, don't we? So, Paul poses a question for us. Who have been the good guys in the Ukraine war? And what about the politics surrounding the war in Ukraine? He answers his own question. The good guys, well, certainly not Putin or nobody in the Kremlin. Certainly not this fascistic dictator, this murderous son of a bitch Putin, and those who back his murderous invasion of Ukraine. Paul writes, his assault on a country directly proximate to his own is nothing on the scale of the United States' arch criminal assaults on nations far from our own shores, like Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia in the last century, and Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya in the current century. But what Putin is doing is a war crime nonetheless. It's chilling to witness the sheer impunity with which the sheltered, super opulent Russian ruler Putin has sent many thousands of Russian soldiers off to die, along with more than 1,000 Ukrainian civilians. That's a conservative number, by the way, including hundreds of children. Instead of pursuing political and diplomatic channels to address Russia's regional security concerns regarding Ukraine, and they are legit, Putin decided instead on mass death and destruction, while at the same time threatening to use nuclear weapons in order to discourage the West, so-called, from launching a military response to Putin's criminal action. And to make matters worse, this murderous bastard has preposterously denied Ukraine's existence as a legitimate nation and ludicrously called Ukraine a Nazi nation engaged in genocide. Now, we know that's madness. We know that's insanity. And along the way of this horror that he has perpetrated in Ukraine, back at home, this tyrant has shut down completely independent media in Russia. What he has done essentially is to declare martial law for the media in Russia. And he has sent his military police to beat and arrest Russian anti-war protesters. He's also directed his government's rubber stamp legislative body, the Duma, to make it a crime carrying a 15-year prison sentence in Russia if anyone calls his war of invasion a war or an invasion. Putin said anyone who does that, and he used a Trump term, one of his puppets, Donald Trump, that it would be fake news, and Putin, would not tolerate that. He's gone on national Russian television to deliver a chilling fascist speech. He calls opponents to the war within his own country fifth columnists full of scum and traitors, and he compared them, his own citizens, to small insects that would be spit out of the mouths of proud Russians. This is Putin. And he likely and wrongly expected a smooth and relatively bloodless takeover of Ukraine. But even having that in his mind, that doesn't absolve him from what he's done. And neither does the fact that the United States significantly provoked this incursion. So Vladimir Putin is a bad son of a bitch. A bad son of a bitch. And in this sense, it's not Biden. Biden's not a bad guy in this. His government in Washington is not. But as Paul points out, you won't find the good guys in Washington either. Paul writes, the United States has no moral standing to denounce any other nation's murderous wars of invasion, given our own much larger criminal superpower record on that score. And to make matters worse, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, not focusing on it, but just mentioning it, the U.S. government has spent years egging the Russian strongman into this latest murderous crime. For example, since the late 1990s, NATO, that is United States, NATO has been boldly violating George Herbert Walker Bush's post-Cold War pledge that the U.S. would not expand NATO eastward toward the Russian border. Now, once again, I know I've talked about this, but I want to go on here. So this U.S.-led, let's call it Humiliate Russia project, has gone full speed ahead. Even though we were warned not to do this from architects of imperialism, such as George Kennan, long dead, Henry Kissinger, Jack Matlock, the current CIA director, William Burns, all sorts of people who have been involved up front, straight ahead in U.S. hegemony and imperialism around the planet. But on this issue, they said, no, you better abide, United States government, by the agreement made by George Herbert Walker Bush to the Russians when the so-called Cold War ended. But as Paul points out, the U.S. government, under various leaders, has been poking the Russian bear in the eye regarding this especially sensitive case of Ukraine since at least 2014. And the U.S. government has been indifferent to the plight of millions put at risk by such imperial jabbing by us far from our shores. It's a critical document that has been widely ignored by U.S. media, but it set Putin and the criminals around him on edge last fall. It was called the Joint Statement on the U.S.-Ukraine Strategic Partnership, and it was signed by Joe Biden last September, and it said that the door was wide open for Ukraine to join NATO. And this paper established a so-called strategic defense framework that provided Ukraine with elite anti-tank and air defense weapons and, quote, a robust training and exercise program in keeping with Ukraine's status as a NATO enhanced opportunities partner, end quote. So all the way back 6 months ago, whatever it was, when this statement was issued by Biden, and did you know about it? No, of course you didn't. Neither did I. I don't think any American did. I wonder how many people in the U.S. government did. Putin knew. Oh, Putin knew for sure. Biden recently damaged chances for peace when he said about Putin during an emotionally upsetting trip to rally NATO forces. He went there to visit the 82nd Airborne in Western Europe and to visit Ukrainian war refugees in Poland. And that's when Biden said, quote, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," end quote. And that was what the Associated Press rightly called, quote, "a dramatic escalation in rhetoric that the White House found itself quickly walking back." Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov quickly denounced Biden, saying, "It's not up to the President of the United States and not up to the Americans to decide who will remain in power in Russia," end quote, Peskov, who I hate. But that was a blunder, even though shortly after Biden said it, I was in complete agreement. And I still feel that way. But for someone in the position of Joe Biden, to quote the cliche, the most powerful man on the planet, to make a statement like that carries with it the weight of suggesting regime change. And when I say it, I mean shit. But this is madness. The top Russian military official said it would use atomic weapons only if it felt that the Russian state itself was in danger. And that's when Joe Biden decided to, I don't know how I should spin it, but personally advocate regime change in Moscow. That's how it was perceived. Now, what is the outcome of that? Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com. And never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.